All right, in the last couple months, I've been noticing a trend, and it's an anecdotal trend for the most part, of people who are on the political left, and certainly not everyone on the political left, but a growing segment of that ideological movement that basically look upon everybody who doesn't agree with them, and especially anybody who directly opposes them in their will, as being unworthy of political power or even representation, to the point of disenfranchising or completely ignoring them, bypassing them, and just simply forcing their views to be hoisted upon everyone else. So, an example of this, I was looking at overseeing a debate on Facebook between a friend of mine. I don't even remember what the topic was. It may have been, I think it might have been climate change. And although my friend is an anarcho-capitalist, he wasn't even arguing from that point of view, but more just a kind of a skeptical, conservative point of view. And before the dialogue had gone more than two comments, the left-wing guy was just said, "I don't care what your opinion is. There's no answers to any of the questions that matter in our society, whether it be climate change, gun control, healthcare, anything, inequality, anything that the right, quote unquote, and the right encompasses everybody basically left right of him, have any answers to. And I don't care about their opinions, and I don't care about their input, and I don't care about anything they have to say. They have proven themselves to be so derelict in terms of contributing to solutions that not only am I not going to listen to them, I think that they should be completely ignored, that they should be completely disenfranchised." And we're starting to see that manifest even more with the Supreme Court. So it's no surprise to my subscribers, and it's no surprise to me, that the court is not an objective uh, third rung of the government, independent of political influence, uh, acting as a kind of protection of the people or of rights or of the Constitution against the potential corruption from the legislative or the executive branch. We know that's not the case. It's never been the case. There have been times when it's been more or less blatant. There have been times when indeed the executive branch and the judicial branch did not get along. There have been a couple times when the executive branch has gone way overboard, and there have been occasionally, historically, justices who were willing to say something about it, although none who could subsequently do anything about it, whether we're talking about Roger Taney and Abraham Lincoln, or the Supreme Court Justice under Andrew Jackson, whose name escapes me, or if we're talking about the Supreme Court under FDR up until 1937, when they invalidated large sections of the New Deal. This does happen, but it is atypical and it is unusual, and it is more than counterbalanced by cooperative courts. So it's no surprise to my subscribers that I would feel this way. I was not one to have the illusion of an objective court, and just the way that it's constituted, there's no way that it could be independent in the way that it would need to be to serve the function that it holds within the civic religion. I suppose it's hypothetically possible that such a court could exist, but it would have to be paid for, nominated, and supported completely independently than any other part of the federal government. It couldn't be appointed by the president. It couldn't be confirmed by the House or the Senate. They couldn't be regulated in any way by them. It would have to be an independent judiciary, and it's certainly not that. Now, in the course of getting into political debates about the pros and cons of various types of government, conservative people, and by that I mean anybody who supports the current existence of a federal government as we have in the United States, like to pretend that we have three branches of government, and they each buttress against the other two, that they compete with each other, and they each act as a bulwark against the excesses of the others. And while it would be wrong to say that they never can and never do, it would be completely naive to think that they consistently act in that way. They certainly don't. And they certainly are not immune to corruption through and through. The legislature is thoroughly corruptible by the executive. The judiciary is also thoroughly corruptible by both the executive and the legislature. And we're seeing this. And how you kind of know, in the course of a debate, people will say, well, hypothetically, no, the Supreme Court's independent, it's fine. But then as soon as we have a nomination process for a new judge, it becomes clear that the vast majority of people who are politically astute don't believe that. That they understand that we're not simply picking a justice who is, has the most purest, um, uh, enlightened view of the law, the greatest jurist. Like Richard Posner is never going to get nominated for the court. Cooley in the 19th century was never nominated for the court. We're not going and saying who is the most qualified, the most august and respected and honest. It's always going to be a political who is going to um, perpetuate the ideology, the policy, and the power of who's ever running the state at the time. And that's why there's such an acrimonious debate about this topic, because it's understood that it isn't some independent judiciary, that it's absolutely not. This isn't a case of protecting it from becoming dependent. They know that it's not, and they're fighting for the spoils to control it. And this is even more clear now because I've seen something that I am not surprised, but I certainly didn't expect. Multiple articles now calling for the packing of the Supreme Court. So if you're not familiar with the term packing of the court, the Constitution does not stipulate how many people can be in the Supreme Court. It just says that there shall be a Supreme Court. It started off with 6 justices. During the 19th century, 1 or 2 were added now and then. There's certainly been vacancies that were either not filled. But court packing, as it's kind of understood today, is based off of an infamous episode in the New Deal. FDR had created all of these blatantly unconstitutional, blatantly terrible New Deal policies, whether it's the National Recovery Agency, NRA. He had cartelized many industries. He had forced unions, forced minimum wages. And the much of this became litigated in the courts, and the Supreme Court started overturning some of these programs and was essentially undoing the New Deal, which is kind of the function that people would have assumed the court is there to do. And so FDR, in a blatant power grab, one so blatant that it was one of his only failures in this regard, was to fill the court with 5 or 6 new justices. He said, well, there's lots of these justices that are old men, which indeed was true. And he said, we need to appoint a new one for every judge over 70, which was going to be 5 or 6 new justices. And of course, he would nominate men who would be pro-New Deal people. And then they would be able to sanctify and legitimize his proposals. I don't know if there was much prospect of them retroactively going back and saying that the NRA was legal, but this was such a blatant power grab that even though FDR was getting his way in almost every other aspect, he had full control of both sides of not full, I shouldn't say full control, but Democratic control of both houses of Congress. There was such a backlash that it didn't happen. However, it ended up having the same effect anyway, because the court was so intimidated by his exercise of power and by the fear that he could pack the court if he wanted, that they started taking a much more sympathetic view. And I believe it was from that point until like 1995, the court never found any federal law unconstitutional. Right, which is of course then a joke when people say that's what it's for, as if all the laws that were passed between 1937 and 1995 or 1997, whenever it was, that not one of them was unconstitutional. They are all legal. And of course, this is just ridiculous that a court appointed by the president, paid by the president, confirmed by the Senate is going to be the judge of what is and is not constitutional. I did a video many years ago called "What if Walmart Rules the World?" and how patently it would asserted it would be if Walmart ran, basically took on government functions and had a monopoly on police forces and legislation and tariffs, and then they had a Walmart court with a judge who was paid by Walmart, was a Walmart employee and appointed by Walmart. And if you ever had a dispute, you and I might have a dispute, and hypothetically, Walmart judge, he might be able to be an objective observer, arbiter in such a dispute. But if we have a dispute with Walmart and the Walmart judge, yeah, definitely a blatant conflict of interest, and there's no way to kind of gerrymander that system to be fair. So, and this is the problem we have with the Supreme Court, and this is the problem that makes it so that it isn't an objective arbiter of disputes whenever there's a dispute with the government. So this was quite an infamous episode, so much so that I don't know that since 1937 there's been any talk of packing the court. But now, because this debate over Kavanaugh, which there were legitimate, excellent, nonpartisan reasons to oppose the Kavanaugh nomination. I mean, the stuff that he did with indefinite detention, with torture, with NSA spying, with wiretapping, that was enough right there that I never want to see this guy in court anywhere, let alone the Supreme Court. But no, the Democrats don't have any actual principles. They don't actually have a policy that is rhetorically worth anything. So they had to basically say he's a rapist based on allegations that mean nothing, essentially, right? We don't know anything whether they're valid or not. They might be, they might not be. There's no evidence that they're true, which is again not to say that they're not, but they have basically surrendered any kind of debate about policy to just say we are going to accuse our enemies of being rapists no matter what. And this is playing into Donald Trump's hand. I think he's being very astute now. He's looking, like I said, most Democrats, most leftists are not SJWs, are not going to tear out their hair and scream and moan, but a lot of them are, and they're the ones who are not only going to be in the news and color the perception of their party, but they're the one who's driving the party. They're the one, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and these are the ones who are dominating the social media of the left, and by extension, even if there's a lag, the policies and the politicians of the left. And so, your quiet grandma who is a Democrat and who maybe doesn't think that Kavanaugh is a rapist. There's no videos of her on Fox News or on CNBC, pulling her hair out and calling the Supreme Court justice a rapist. And so Trump can say, look at these people. I just saw him give a speech the other day. This is a senseless mob that can't be trusted to govern. Please don't vote for them because they're completely out of control. And he's got a point. And I think it's a very, very sound strategy. I don't know if how much it's going to help in the midterms. I think it's going to help some. Well, it will allow the Republicans to maintain majorities in both houses. I don't know. It's certainly going to help some, though. But, I saw a relative of mine post about court packing and just said, we need to do this. Like, we need to have the power. So there's kind of this dropping of the pretense of rule of law and democracy. And the left has been doing this more and more. Oh, we lost the election. Well, you know what? Fuck the Electoral College. Fuck elections. Fuck, what? The Russians spent $100,000, which is what, 1.01% of the difference between what Donald Trump spent and Hillary Clinton spent. The whole election is invalid. You kind of even see this in other places like the UK with Brexit. All right, so Brexit passes, and now you have this big movement of people saying, we need to vote on it again. We need to vote on it again. So we come into this situation where if we vote and we get the solution that we want, the result that we want, well, then democracy has spoken, and it's inviolable, and you can't change that, and you can't question that. That's basically a sacred result. But if we get a result we don't like, we got to vote again. We got to vote again. It didn't count. Heads I win, tails we flip again, over and over and over and over again. And this is where their rhetoric has been leading, and it's becoming increasingly, we are going to govern and rule by power as much. We're going to use the levers of power as blatantly as we can, without any moderation, without any consolation. This started happening under Obama, with the Obamacare passing without any Republican input. There was a famous meeting he had with Eric Cantor and some of the other House leaders. Says, "I won the election. I won. I get what I want." And of course, they could retort, "We won too. We got elected. You have a House of Representatives with lots of Republicans." But I don't blame only him. But it's an outgrowth of an ideology and a rhetoric of, we already know the answer. We already know, for instance, that there has to be gun control. We already know that. And if you don't believe that, then that means you're on the take of the NRA. I mean, I don't know. That's such a patently ridiculous idea, and yet I don't know anyone who favors gun control who doesn't believe the only reason that there's any recalcitrance on this issue is because of NRA corruption and dirty NRA money. Never mind how little they spend, and never mind the tens of millions of gun owners who are voters and donators and who care about the issue. That doesn't matter. They know it's right, and if democracy, isn't validating their worldview, then to hell with democracy. So we're kind of dropping the veil here a little bit. Now, I think this is not necessarily new. This has happened in the past. Behind the facade of a consensual democratic temple, there's an iron fist. There always was. We've seen it before, and the left is blatantly talking about unveiling it again. It's not going to work, I don't think. We have a situation where people are saying we don't want to have a civil debate. We don't want to have consensus building. We're just going to force our way on everybody else. And that really doesn't make a lot of sense when everybody else is the armed half of the society and you are the unarmed half of society. But, I'll give them credit for, being stupidly ignorant and being willing to take a risk like that. I don't think they have any idea the kind of fire that they could be playing with. As soon as they start saying we're going to rule, I mean, and it said this in the article too, like, oh, so you're going to appoint 5 new judges to undo Kavanaugh. What happens when the Republicans take power? They don't think they're going to appoint 20 more judges? It just completely does away with. There's no pretense then that this is anything other than a completely politically controlled arm of the government. It even said one of the articles that the purpose of the Supreme Court, this is from a leftist, the purpose of the Supreme Court is to validate left-wing decisions, whether it's Roe v. Wade or Obamacare or union rights or regulatory power. That's the point of the court. And historically, they're right. That's what the court has been doing in the 20th century, at least since the New Deal, if not slightly before. In many cases, actually legitimizing government powers that in the past it actually said were not legitimate. Minimum wage laws were struck down on numerous occasions in the past, only to have them under FDR say, "Oh no, Commerce Clause gives you the right to basically do unlimited regulation, essentially." So, yeah, the flowery. This is what's always kind of irked me in these debates you have with people about democracy. People speak about it in terms that are disingenuous for how it actually functions. They talk about it like it's actually based on consent, that it's actually based on consensus, that it's the will of the people manifest. And then when the will of the people is something that they don't like, or the will of the people is not sufficiently majoritarian where they need it to pass the laws that they want, then all of a sudden it's, we're going to do whatever we can. We're going to take what we can. We're going to force what we can. By any means necessary, right? I mean, that's actually, if you don't know, by any means necessary is an actual organization, right? They will do whatever they think is necessary. And this is the rhetoric and the logical conclusion of most of the ideology of the left. I mean, obviously there are leftists with more nuance than that do exist, who have a platform or a voice, but they're not driving the party. They're not driving the narrative. They're not motivating the crowds of people. The thoughtful, moderate leftists, yeah, of course they're out there, but they're not getting people up in arms. They're not having people show up to rallies. They're not filling Twitter. They have surrendered. They can't debate. They can't come up and resist the identity politics that is subsuming the entire party. And what did I read? Identity politics ultimately always favor the majority. So this is really, really playing with fire on their part. Um, I think that they should tread lightly. I really do. Unless, I mean, I can always play it out in the head and think, well, this could end up being good in the long run. I don't. It could also end up being horribly bad. So I'm going to attach links to some of these articles. The court packing schemes, blatant power grabs, blatant attempts to thwart democracy. It's also interesting where you have them say, "Oh, Donald Trump is ruining the system. We should abolish the Electoral College." What? That's ruining the system. All right. So, uh, you know, again, democracy is selectively invoked. When it gives you the solution that they want, they believe in it. When it doesn't, then it needs to be reformed in a way that will give them the result that they want. Like a la Brexit Part 2, uh, or packing the court or whatever else. So, uh, you know, I've talked about this before. It's not new, but we're getting an increasingly acrimonious, increasing bifurcation in the country. We really do. Whether left, right, Republicans, Democrats, townies, Brahmins, things are getting worse and worse, and it's becoming harder and harder for us to talk, and it's becoming increasingly, we can't even understand each other. I think the libertarians and moderates, and Jonathan Haidt has talked about this, and even conservatives, they have an ability to understand where leftists are coming from. A libertarian or even a conservative can express the views of a leftist accurately. Leftists cannot express the views of conservatives, let alone libertarians, accurately. They do not understand, at least statistically, what the other side believes and how they think. They can't. They don't understand it. And so we can't have a meaningful dialogue. The language is splitting, and the history is splitting. When we look at, when they look at history, they see federal government solves all the problems. Federal government is beneficent, and all resistance to federal power is racism and sexism and regressionism and corporatism and everything good has come from the government, and everything good has come from collectivism and socialism, and everything bad has come from the right wing and from slavery, and there's no nuance there, and there's no appreciation of the other side. And so, it sounds hyperbolic, but when you get to the point where you can't talk and you can't compromise, what's left but to either separate or to fight? There's no other alternative, and we're getting to the point where there are red lines that people are not going to cross. And we've already seen some of this happen, whether it was with the Bundys. I think gun control is definitely an issue where this could happen. I mean, let's say we get a Democratic president in there and they basically try and pass Australian-style gun control. That's not happening. I'm sorry, that's not happening in the United States. And, maybe you'll feel good in your Twitter feed, but that's just not going to happen. Maybe everyone is a liberal, and you think everyone agrees with you, and you might be right that there are millions of people who do, but there's millions of other people that you just don't know, that you have circumcised yourself from, that you've separated yourself from. Right? We're getting that. Social media is allowing us to segregate ourselves in that way, that we can put ourselves in an echo chamber, and the people who aren't in there are the evil other. And I would be fine with separation. I'm an advocate of that. I don't know if that's how this is going to play out. I don't know if leftists can have it in them to let go and let people go. They didn't let people go the first time. I don't know if New England has the desire to send hundreds of thousands of to fight and die. I don't know if they still have that level of resolve that they did in 1861, but I don't think that they would just nicely allow it to go. Like they have as Solo points out, they have a vision of the world, and that's a vision where they're in control of everything. And the idea of dispersal of powers. Like I remember reading in the article about, and I'll post a link to it, about packing the court. They said, well, look, maybe there are problems, maybe it leads to escalation, but there's no other solution, right? It is politicized. It's never going to be an objective judiciary floating above partisan politics. And so there's no alternative. We have to do this. Well, there is. The alternative is that you eliminate power of the court, that you give it less things to talk about, that you make it less contentious because it's not deciding so much. You devolve power more and more to the states, and then it's not such a contentious issue, right? If abortion is left up to the states, then it's not so important whether Kavanaugh is for abortion or against abortion. It only matters because you've given federal hegemony power to do anything. If you give the federal government carte blanche to rule on every and any issue, then yes, the Supreme Court is extremely important. If, on the other hand, you have decentralized power and you have 50 different states, it's not so important. But, the author of this article, that would never occur to them. And if you were to bring it up, I'm sure that they would find that absolutely, even though there is actually a history of leftists, favoring localism, that strain of leftism gets you nowhere today, right? That goes against the vision of controlling everything that they all lust for, that lust for power, that lust to rule over everyone. They would never concede to that. So even though that is a very viable, possible solution that's fairly obvious and doesn't entail escalating to the point of civil war, which is where ultimately this would go if you take it the other way, they can't do it. So I'm not saying that there's an immediate thing that's going to happen here. I think it is going to have an effect in the midterms, but that's even that's in the relative short period. But yes, things are becoming much more acrimonious, much more difficult to discuss. The left is so awful that it has now repeatedly led me to the point of supporting, or at least nominally sympathizing with horrible conservatives like Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh should not be on the court. He's a terrible fascist as far as I'm concerned. Whether or not he committed these ridiculous these rapes. The same thing. I never thought I'd ever feel good for Marco Rubio, but then when you see him getting told that he's a murderer, and he is a murderer for his support of the wars, but he's a murderer because of what happened in Parkland, which, to his credit, the student who said that has now recanted, said that was inappropriate for him to say. Kudos to him. So maybe there's a glimmer of hope if some people have that capability, but the left is so out of control and so animalistic and so identitarian and so explicit in their belief that white men especially, should have second-class status, who should be are wrong until proven right, are guilty until proven innocent, are inherently evil and should have no say, and that they should be as disenfranchised as is physically possible. Then what am I left but to have to support the people who are just really bad nationalists? So anyway, I will talk to you all another time, and have a good night.